Can you believe it? One simple word, Rome, the name of a city built on 7 unassuming hills. Yet that single word became the architectural blueprint for every government, every law, and every highway we still use today. It wasn't just an empire, it was a permanent scar etched into the very face of human civilization, stretching out across 3 continents and lasting nearly 2,000 years. This is the saga of how the greatest power the world had ever seen ascended to heights that defied gravity, and then suffered a catastrophe no one saw coming. The slow, agonizing death of a god made of stone and steel. Prepare yourself, because we are diving into the definitive, deeply immersive, and terrifying true story of the Roman Empire. They grew up strong, reckless, and fiercely ambitious, dreaming of founding a great city right where they had been saved. But ambition, as it always does in Rome, required blood. They disagreed violently over where the sacred boundary should be drawn, one favoring the Palatine Hill, the other the Aventine. This wasn't a zoning dispute. This was the first Roman civil war, fought by an audience of 2. But the fledgling city faced an immediate, existential problem. It was filled entirely with men, runaways, bandits, exiles, and desperate farmers. There were no wives, no mothers, no future. The Roman solution? Not diplomacy, not negotiation, but pure, unadulterated kidnapping on a massive, terrifying scale. They invited their neighbors, the peaceable Sabines, to a grand festival, a celebration of their new settlement. The Sabines, trusting and perhaps naive, arrived in droves, bringing their entire families. Then, at a prearranged signal, the feast turned into a horrifying trap. The Sabines, predictably, responded with fury, mobilizing their armies for immediate and total war. Just as the final, decisive battle was about to erupt, swords drawn, shields locked, something utterly unbelievable happened. The kidnapped women, now dressed in Roman garb, rushed onto the battlefield between the 2 warring armies. They stood there, weeping, holding their newly born Roman children, appealing to their fathers and brothers on one side, and their new husbands on the other. "Do not fight," they cried. "Whichever side wins, we lose. We are either widows or orphans." This emotional, unprecedented intervention halted the bloodshed instantly. It was a moment of profound transformation. The 2 peoples, recognizing their intertwined fate, decided to stop fighting and instead merge, instantly doubling Rome's population and military strength. This willingness to absorb enemies and make them citizens, this was the hidden superpower that would drive Rome's unstoppable expansion. For the next 2 centuries, Rome was ruled by kings, not mythical figures, but actual monarchs, mostly drawn from the nearby Etruscan civilization, who brought engineering, architecture, and sophisticated urban planning to the muddy village. They built the Cloaca Maxima, the colossal sewage system that still runs beneath the city today, a testament to their early mastery of infrastructure. But the Romans were not built for submission. Their destiny was not to be ruled by a single man, no matter how powerful. The breaking point arrived with the 7th and final king, Tarquin the Proud, and his name truly told the entire bloody story. The people rose up, unified by this profound violation. Tarquin the Proud and his entire family were instantly banished from the city, never allowed to return. This wasn't just a change of government. This was a revolutionary oath, a terrifying commitment that Rome would never again suffer the chains of monarchy. In 509 BC, the Roman Republic was born, a system designed specifically to prevent one man from ever holding too much power. It was a beautiful, chaotic, and fundamentally unstable idea, governed by two consuls elected annually, checked by a powerful Senate, and relying on the sacred, often exploited will of the people. They had exchanged a single king for a terrifying hydra of internal political conflict. But this conflict, this constant wrestling match between power and liberty, was precisely the engine that would drive Rome to conquer the world. They had survived their birth, survived their kings, and now they faced the immediate, terrifying reality of their neighbors. They were surrounded by enemies who saw the newborn republic as weak, vulnerable, and ripe for the taking. Rome had no choice but to fight, constantly, ruthlessly, strategically. The next 200 years would be spent locked in a grinding, desperate struggle for survival against the fierce tribes of central Italy, a battle that would forge the legendary Roman legionary. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared them for the true existential threat waiting across the narrow strait, a power so wealthy, so ancient, and so utterly ruthless that Rome nearly vanished from history before it ever truly began. Get ready, because the shadow of Carthage is rising, and Rome is about to face the defining moment of its existence in the crucible of fire known as the Punic Wars. This fragile republic is about to be tested by Hannibal Barca, and the world is about to watch Rome either rise to glory or be annihilated forever. The air was thick with the scent of salt and blood. After centuries of brutal self-definition, Rome, the young wolf of the Mediterranean, had finally encountered a rival worthy of its absolute fury. Carthage, the ancient Phoenician Leviathan, ruling the seas and hoarding the wealth of the known world. This was not a border skirmish or a tribal spat. This was an uncompromising, apocalyptic struggle for the soul of global dominance, known to history as the Punic Wars. The First Punic War, a grinding 23-year meat grinder, was fought almost entirely on the water, a domain where Rome had zero experience. They were farmers, land takers, legionaries. They knew dirt, not the deep azure. Carthage laughed at their incompetence on the open sea, secure in the knowledge of their vast, powerful fleet. But Rome, in a feat of arrogant, impossible engineering, built a navy from scratch in months, tearing apart a single wrecked Carthaginian quinquereme as a blueprint. They learned to fight on the waves by bringing the land to the sea, inventing the corvus, the raven, a massive grappling hook bridge. This insane device turned naval battles into land battles, locking ships together so the invincible Roman legionaries could storm the decks. It was clumsy, unstable, and often sank their own fleet in high seas. Yet the sheer audacity and ruthless determination meant it worked. Rome won the first round, crushing Carthage and stripping them of Sicily. But the true terror was yet to be unleashed. 20 years later, that oath exploded across the Alps. Hannibal, against all logic and sanity, marched an army of 50,000 men, heavy cavalry, and the infamous war elephants, the ancient world's equivalent of tanks, over the impossible frozen peaks of the tallest mountain range in Europe. It was a logistical nightmare that cost him half his force, yet the survivors who descended into the Italian plains were hardened, fanatical shock troops ready to burn the heartland of the Republic. The stage was set for the greatest military disaster in Roman history, a word that would forever live in infamy. Cannae, 216 BC. The Republic gathered its strength, assembling perhaps 86,000 men, the largest army Rome had ever fielded, determined to crush the Carthaginian insect once and for all. Hannibal had less than 50,000. The numbers meant nothing. Hannibal executed the perfect double envelopment, a tactical masterpiece that military academies still study today. He placed his weakest troops in the center, allowing them to bend back like a bowstring under the relentless Roman advance, drawing the legions deeper and deeper into the trap. As the Roman flanks pressed inward, convinced they were winning, Hannibal's veteran African cavalry slammed into the Roman rear. Suddenly, the legions were not fighting an enemy. They were fighting themselves. They were trapped, shoulder to shoulder, unable to wield their weapons, unable to maneuver, pressed into a horrifying, suffocating mass. For 8 excruciating hours, the Carthaginian forces systematically slaughtered the trapped Romans, hacking them down until the killing floor was slick with gore. The final butcher's bill was unthinkable. Between 50,000 and 70,000 Roman soldiers died on that single field in a single day, including dozens of senators, high-ranking magistrates, and a sitting consul. The sheer volume of death was so immense that Hannibal famously sent sacks of gold rings taken from the fallen noblemen back to Carthage, dumping them onto the Senate floor as proof of his victory. Rome was in shock. The gates of the city were locked. Panic was absolute. They thought Hannibal would march straight up and destroy them. But Hannibal, surprisingly, hesitated, lacking the heavy siege equipment to assault the fortified capital. The Senate, humbled and terrified, turned to Quintus Fabius Maximus, the only man left who could offer a viable path to survival. Fabius proposed a strategy so deeply unpopular, so contrary to the aggressive Roman character, that he was instantly mocked and ridiculed. He ordered the armies to avoid direct confrontation entirely. He would shadow Hannibal, burning the crops, poisoning the wells, harassing supply lines, refusing to fight a pitched battle. This was the strategy of delay, earning Fabius the nickname Cunctator, the delayer. It was humiliating. Romans demanded glory. They demanded vengeance. They accused Fabius of cowardice, of treason, of stretching the war out for his own political gain. Yet this grinding, patient, attritional warfare was the only thing saving Rome from total annihilation. A young, brilliant, and deeply charismatic general emerged from the shadow of the defeats, Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Africanus. Scipio realized the fundamental truth: Rome could never defeat Hannibal while he was on Italian soil. They had to take the war to Carthage, striking at the throat of the enemy's power structure. He then mastered Hannibal's own tactics, training his men in speed and flexibility. Scipio was a new kind of Roman general, more Greek in his strategy, less brute force, more intellectual. His audacious move forced Carthage's hand. They recalled Hannibal from Italy to defend the homeland, ending the occupation that had terrified Rome for 15 years. The final act of this epic clash occurred in North Africa, at Zama, 202 BC. The two titans of the age finally faced each other on equal terms. Hannibal, older, perhaps relying too heavily on his untrained Carthaginian troops, and Scipio, young, confident, and tactically flawless. Hannibal deployed his war elephants, hoping to repeat the terror of the Alps. But Scipio had learned the lesson. He arrayed his legions in open columns, creating vast lanes for the elephants to charge harmlessly through, confusing the beasts and turning their own panic back onto the Carthaginian lines. The battle turned on the cavalry. Scipio's Roman and Numidian cavalry routed their Carthaginian counterparts, chased them off the field, and then, in the crucial moment, wheeled back to smash into the rear of Hannibal's infantry, the mirror image of the Cannae disaster. But this time, Rome was the executioner. Carthage was utterly defeated. Hannibal escaped, but the war was over. Rome dictated the terms: surrender of all warships, massive annual indemnity payments that crippled Carthage economically, and a ban on ever raising an army without Roman permission. The Republic had survived the greatest threat it would ever face. But the price of victory, the staggering influx of wealth, slaves, and foreign land, was about to change the Roman social structure forever. The Republic had won the world, but it was now about to start losing itself. The Republic had achieved the impossible. It had defeated Carthage, broken the back of the Hellenistic kingdoms, and annexed the entirety of the Mediterranean world. But the staggering flood of gold, slaves, and conquered land did not bring peace. It brought a terminal fever, an unstoppable social cancer that began to consume the very foundations of Roman society from the inside out. The citizen soldiers, the backbone of the legions who bled across Africa and Greece, returned home only to find their modest farms ruined, their lands absorbed into vast, sprawling slave-run estates known as latifundia, owned by the same wealthy senatorial class who had funded the wars. Rome was now a city of unimaginable disparity. A tiny elite choked on wealth and political power, while the vast majority were landless, desperate, and increasingly enraged. This was not merely an economic problem. It was an existential crisis for the military, because only landowning citizens could legally serve in the legions. The Republic was running out of Romans who qualified to fight its increasingly long and complex wars. Into this volatile mess stepped two men, brothers, aristocrats who dared to look past their own gilded lives, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. They were the first true revolutionaries of Rome, and their names would forever be etched in blood and tragedy. In 133 BC, Tiberius Gracchus, serving as tribune of the plebs, proposed the unthinkable: radical land reform. He demanded that the vast tracts of public land, illegally hoarded by the oligarchs, be redistributed back to the poor, effectively solving the military manpower crisis while simultaneously striking a direct, mortal blow at the wealth base of the Senate. Yet the true, apocalyptic shift was still coming, not from the radical reformers, but from the armies themselves. Enter Gaius Marius, a general of astonishing talent, a novus homo, new man, from outside the aristocracy, who rose purely through military genius. Marius understood the manpower crisis better than anyone, and in 107 BC, he enacted the single most destructive policy of the late Republic. He abolished the property requirement for military service. He opened the legions to the capite censi, the landless citizens, the desperate poor, promising them pay, armor, and most critically, land upon retirement. This reform solved the manpower crisis instantly, creating a devastatingly effective professional fighting force. But it came at a monumental cost. The soldiers were no longer loyal to the Republic, the Senate, or the concept of Rome. They were loyal solely to the general who provided their livelihood and their future. Marius had inadvertently invented the warlord. He had placed the ultimate loaded weapon on the table of the Republic, and it would not take long for someone to pick it up and point it directly at Rome itself. That man was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a brilliant, brutal, and deeply traditional aristocratic general who had once served under Marius, but who now chafed under his shadow and ambition. The ultimate clash came over a profitable command against King Mithridates VI of Pontus. The Senate awarded the command to Sulla, but Marius, old and desperate for glory, used his political influence and violence to have the command illegally transferred to himself. Sulla, hearing this betrayal while still with his 6 legions outside the gates of Rome, made a decision that echoed through history and sealed the Republic's doom. Sulla did the unthinkable. He marched his legions on Rome. The sacred military barrier, the pomerium, was broken. The idea that a general would turn the instruments of state power against the state itself was an absolute violation of all Roman tradition, a blasphemy only the legendary Coriolanus had ever dared contemplate. Sulla seized the city, brutally suppressed Marius's faction, and established a terrifying military dictatorship, only to immediately march east to fight Mithridates. While Sulla was away, Marius returned, taking the city in a horrifying frenzy of revenge, executing Sulla's supporters in the streets. When Sulla finally returned victorious years later, he was no longer a general. He was the embodiment of vengeance. He initiated the proscriptions, official state-sanctioned murder lists posted in the Forum. Sulla had retired, convinced that by restoring the traditional forms of the Senate and crushing his enemies under a mountain of severed heads, he had saved the Republic. But when a tyrant steps down, he doesn't leave behind stability. He leaves a radioactive crater of ambition where laws used to stand. The precedent was set. Violence worked. Law was negotiable. And the greatest men in Rome, the ones who watched Sulla most closely, were already plotting their own spectacular entrances, ready to perfect Sulla's failed experiment in absolute control. 2 names immediately began to eclipse the Senate itself, demanding recognition through sheer, terrifying military might. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, a military prodigy who earned his nickname not through age or wisdom, but through blood spilled across Africa and Spain, demanding triumphs before he was legally old enough to hold office. He was the young, arrogant storm, always demanding adoration and ever loyal legions, yet always slightly insecure about his aristocratic legitimacy. Standing opposite him was Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man whose greatness was measured not in military victories, but in sheer, suffocating, unbelievable wealth. Crassus had turned Sulla's brutal proscriptions into a highly profitable investment opportunity, effectively privatizing Roman terror by buying up confiscated estates for pennies on the denarius. He owned entire city blocks, controlled politicians with golden chains, and understood that true power wasn't held by legions, but by debt, and he held Rome's collective ledger. But before these 2 titanic egos could truly clash and divide the spoils, the universe threw Rome a curveball built of iron and desperation: Spartacus, a Thracian gladiator, a slave, who broke free from a training school and ignited a rebellion that ripped through the heart of Italy, threatening the very sanctity of Roman property and social order. This was not some distant barbarian threat. This was an existential nightmare happening in Rome's backyard, proving that the foundation of the Republic, its reliance on slave labor, was also its greatest vulnerability. While Pompey and Crassus strutted, demanding consulships, ignoring the laws that restricted their age and status, and abusing the rules of the Republic, a third figure was quietly, meticulously preparing his entrance: Gaius Julius Caesar. Unlike the other 2, Caesar was born into ancient, though relatively poor, aristocratic lineage. He had charm, political genius, 0 money, and a terrifying singular focus on rewriting history. Caesar understood the game better than anyone. The old Republican system was a hollow shell, guarded only by tradition and the fear of revolution. The path to ultimate power lay not through respecting the Senate, but through controlling the people, the plebeians, and the soldiers. He was a master manipulator, weaving debts and favors into an unstoppable populist political machine. By 60 BC, the political situation was an unsustainable gridlock. Pompey felt criminally slighted by the Senate, which refused to ratify his eastern military settlements or grant land to his loyal veterans. Crassus, perpetually greedy, wanted tax breaks for his wealthy allies and recognition for his financial power. Caesar, crushed by debts he had accrued to fund his political climb, desperately needed a consulship to escape his creditors and launch his own military career to gain wealth and glory. They hated each other. They distrusted each other completely. But they realized that individually, the stubborn, frightened Senate could block them all indefinitely. Together, they could burn the Senate down and take what they wanted. In secret, this impossible alliance was forged. The first triumvirate, the three-headed monster that would devour the last vestiges of the Republic. It was not a legal office. It was a ruthless contract, a conspiracy to divide the known world amongst themselves, operating entirely outside the Constitution they swore to uphold. When the public finally realized what had happened, Cicero, the great orator, the champion of the dying republic, called it a monstrous tyranny. He saw the future clearly. Rome was no longer ruled by laws, but by the private, violent whims of three exceptionally dangerous men who were only bound together by mutual necessity. Caesar took his consulship in 59 BC, and he didn't waste a single hour. He ignored the Senate, using armed soldiers and the threat of popular violence to ram through legislation, demonstrating immediately who truly held power. He then secured his future by obtaining the governorship of Cisalpine Gaul, Illyricum, and later Transalpine Gaul, a massive territory encompassing modern France and Switzerland, filled with restless tribes. This was no backwater assignment. Gaul was vast, rich, and perpetually unstable, the perfect killing ground to turn an ambitious, indebted politician into an untouchable military god with an army entirely devoted to him, not to Rome. He had secured not just an army, but the legal distance from the capital that would allow him to grow his power without immediate interference from his rivals. The triumvirate was holding the Republic in a state of suspended animation, but the alliance was inherently unstable. Crassus wanted more gold and the glorious military command Pompey and Caesar already possessed. Pompey wanted to maintain his mythical status as Rome's only great general. Caesar wanted everything, and he was already marching towards it. The stage was set for the greatest, most devastating clash of egos in Roman history, as the three friends plotted each other's eventual downfall, knowing that the only stable number in Roman power was one. The air in Rome didn't just thicken, it became pressurized, toxic, and dangerously flammable. The formation of the first triumvirate, this unholy alliance of Julius Caesar, Gnaeus Pompey Magnus, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, was the exact moment the Republic officially signed its own death warrant, even if the vast majority of the citizenry failed to grasp the magnitude of the betrayal. These three men were not patriots sharing power. These were three apex predators trapped in the same cage, politely nodding while sharpening their knives for the inevitable final duel. The world held its breath, waiting for the bloodbath to commence, because in the brutal, immutable arithmetic of Roman power, 3 always had to become 1, and the resulting chaos would be absolute. Caesar, the most politically acute of the 3, understood that power required immediate, ruthless legitimation. He demanded the consulship for 59 BC, and he used Pompey's legions and Crassus's bottomless treasury to absolutely bulldoze every law, tradition, and sacred custom the frightened Senate could throw in his path. When his conservative co-consul Bibulus attempted to obstruct his land bills, designed to reward Pompey's loyal veterans, Caesar didn't just ignore him, he had him physically assaulted in the forum by armed thugs and veteran soldiers. Bibulus, humiliated and fearing for his life, was forced to flee the public eye, declaring that since the gods were clearly against this tyranny, he would merely stay home and observe the heavens for the rest of his term. This was not governance. This was the performance of a hostile takeover of the highest office, turning the sacred space of Roman political life into a permanent, riotous zone ruled by the threat of violence. Caesar was showing Rome, brutally and explicitly, that the old rules, the venerable laws of the ancestors, were now utterly meaningless if they stood in the way of ambition backed by gold and steel. The Senate, paralyzed by fear and their own rigid adherence to procedure, could only retreat and mutter darkly about the coming reckoning, entirely missing the critical point that the reckoning had already arrived, wrapped in the fashionable toga of a popular but utterly ruthless reformer. Caesar then secured his critical next move, a massive, unprecedented 5-year proconsular command, later extended to 10, in the untamed wilds of Gaul, beyond the Alps. Every scroll dispatched back to Rome was a calculated political move, reminding the populace that while the entrenched optimates squabbled and poisoned the well of the Republic, Caesar was making Rome safer, infinitely richer, and spectacularly more glorious, even if that glory was entirely paved with the skulls of entirely innocent tribes. But if Caesar was consolidating his future, Crassus was utterly consumed by jealousy of his past. Crassus, the wealthiest man in the known world, found that his boundless fortune could not buy the one thing he desperately craved: true military glory and the adoration of the legions, the kind of acclaim Pompey and now Caesar commanded. He saw Caesar's rapidly escalating fame and decided he needed his own Eastern triumph, a magnificent, definitive victory over the mighty Parthian Empire, Rome's most formidable rival beyond the Euphrates. His ambition became a magnificent, tragic flaw. Ignoring every desperate warning from his priests and his seasoned generals, ignoring every terrifying omen that spoke of disaster, he poured his entire fortune and reputation into raising an army and marching straight into the Mesopotamian desert in 53 BC. The resulting clash, the Battle of Carrhae, was not merely a defeat, it was a catastrophic, textbook annihilation. Roman heavy infantry, designed to crush tribal resistance, was completely helpless against the swift, heavily armored Parthian cataphracts and the deadly accurate hit-and-run horse archers. The Parthians employed the terrifying Parthian shot, turning every Roman attempt at maneuver or retreat into a desperate, bloody slaughter. Crassus, his son slain before his eyes, died ignominiously, possibly executed during a panicked, futile peace negotiation. They saw Pompey, now stripped of his political rivals, as the only force capable of stopping the monster they had all collectively helped Caesar create and unleash in the wilds of Gaul. The ultimate confrontation was now inevitable, a direct, final reckoning between the two giants of the collapsing republic. It was no longer about land bills or political appointments. It was about whether Rome would survive the return of its most dangerously successful son, who now commanded an army utterly devoted to him, ready to march on the sacred boundaries of the capital itself. The gears of fate ground slowly, but they ground exceedingly fine, setting the stage for the true, final civil war that would utterly dissolve the 500-year-old republic. The republic, that brittle, magnificent thing forged on the blood of kings, was finally gone. Not with a whimper, but with the thunderous, agonizing screams of 1,000 proscribed senators and knights. The vacuum left by Caesar's assassination was not filled by the peace the conspirators had promised, but by a monstrous, unstable triumvirate, a ruthless boy named Octavian, Caesar's designated heir, the battle-hardened, charismatic war dog Mark Antony, and the utterly unremarkable Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, a man destined to be erased from history's ledger. These three men, bound together by the necessity of vengeance and the promise of absolute power, immediately set about carving up the known world and spilling the best blood of Rome to fund their ambitions. They established the Second Triumvirate, a legally sanctioned dictatorship that made Sulla look like a compassionate amateur, instituting the horrific system known as the proscriptions. The true prize, however, was the final eradication of the Republican dream, personified by the remaining assassins, Brutus and Cassius, who had fled east and gathered vast, desperate legions under the faded banner of liberty. At Philippi, in the dust-choked fields of Macedonia in 42 BCE, the fate of the Republic was sealed forever, decided by the cold, calculating ruthlessness of Octavian and the seasoned military genius of Antony. The conspirators fell, driven to suicide by the relentless historical weight of Caesar's vengeance. Victory secured, the three vultures momentarily divided the carcass of the world. Lepidus, the weakest link, was quickly shunted off to a forgotten corner of Africa and stripped of meaningful power, leaving the two true titans, Antony and Octavian, to stare at each other across an ever-widening, bloody chasm of distrust and unfulfilled ambition. Antony, the celebrated general, took the opulent, fertile East, where the gold flowed like rivers and the temptations were magnificent beyond comprehension. He became infatuated with Hellenistic royalty and the promise of effortless Eastern luxury, setting his headquarters not in a Roman camp, but in Alexandria. There, he met his ultimate fate in the form of Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt, a woman who did not merely rule a kingdom, but commanded the very imagination and desires of the ancient world with her lethal intellect and magnetic presence. His alliance with her was not just a diplomatic maneuver, it was a brazen, scandalous declaration of independence from the austere, traditional values of Rome itself, symbolized by the gifts of Roman territories he bestowed upon her and their joint children. Meanwhile, back in Italy, the seemingly sickly, intellectually gifted Octavian was playing a game infinitely more sophisticated than brute force. He waged a war of propaganda, a psychological campaign designed to capture the Roman soul. He meticulously leveraged Roman fear, prejudice, and deep-seated suspicion of foreign power, painting Antony not as a co-ruler, but as a treasonous, decadent captive of an exotic, corrupt foreign queen. He told Rome that Antony was plotting to move the capital to Alexandria, replacing the humble gods of the Tiber with the sun-drenched deities of the Nile, and replacing the Roman legions with Eastern eunuchs and slaves. The West, Octavian proclaimed, must be saved from the moral decay of the East. The tension metastasized into open war, framed by Octavian not as a civil struggle, but as a holy war between the stoic, rugged, lawful identity of Rome and the perceived weakness and sensuality of the Ptolemaic monarchy. The ultimate, decisive climax arrived on the churning, wine-dark waters of Actium in 31 BCE, a naval engagement so vast it darkened the entire horizon with sails, smoke, and the clash of iron. It was a cataclysmic disaster for Antony and the ultimate triumph of Octavian's superior tactical deployment and logistics. Cleopatra, seeing her fleet disintegrate and the momentum utterly lost, fled the battle, and Antony, in a moment of catastrophic historical weakness, abandoned his men and followed her back to Egypt, sealing his fate as a coward and a fool in the eyes of his legions. Octavian pursued them relentlessly, marching into Alexandria, where both lovers chose the final, dramatic exit of suicide. Cleopatra, by the alleged asp bite, rather than facing the unimaginable humiliation of being paraded as trophies in a Roman triumph. With Antony dead and the limitless treasures of Egypt pouring into the Roman coffers, Octavian stood alone, the last man standing after a century of relentless civil war. He held absolute, unchallenged power over an exhausted, shattered world that was utterly sick of conflict. But he was too clever, too politically astute to call himself king or dictator. The memory of Caesar's fate was too fresh. Instead, in a breathtakingly deceptive political maneuver in 27 BCE, he publicly declared that he was restoring the Republic, handing all his extraordinary powers back to the Senate and the people of Rome. The Senate, composed now entirely of his own terrified or grateful appointees, immediately rejected his resignation and insisted that he retain command of the most crucial provinces, the military and the public purse. He took the title Princeps, First Citizen, and was granted the sacred, historically loaded name Augustus, the Revered One. The people cheered this apparent end of tyranny, unknowingly celebrating the installation of the very first emperor, a monarch who wore the carefully tailored mask of republican legitimacy. The 500-year-old republic was now merely a beautiful, hollow facade, hiding the face of an absolute military monarchy that would endure for 5 more centuries, ushering in the golden, terrible, and fragile peace known as the Pax Romana. The Pax Romana, 200 years of suffocating quietude, purchased in blood and enforced by the gleaming, terrible efficiency of the Roman legions. This was not peace in the way philosophers preached it. It was the total subjugation of the known world, frozen solid under the crushing weight of one man's authority, the cunning, cold authority of Caesar Augustus. He had achieved what no one else dared. He dismantled the Republic without firing a single shot against its ghosts, retaining the titles of magistrate and tribune while holding the absolute military command of the Princeps, the first citizen. He was the ultimate illusionist, crafting a perfect lie that the Senate still held sway, even as the gold in the treasury and the loyalty of every professional soldier flowed solely through his divine hands. His greatest, most terrible innovation was the creation of the Praetorian Guard, 9 cohorts of elite, highly paid killers stationed right inside the city gates, a constant, silent reminder that Rome's freedom was now conditional, dependent entirely on the emperor's good mood. Claudius, the stuttering, scholarly uncle, was literally found hiding behind a curtain after Caligula's assassination and dragged, trembling, onto the throne. surviving only by sheer wit, incredible administrative competence, and the systematic poisoning of his enemies, and eventually himself, orchestrated by his ruthlessly ambitious wife, Agrippina the Younger. The empire was immediately ripped apart in 69 AD, the catastrophic year of 4 emperors, a brutal, violent reminder that the so-called peace was only maintained by the absolute loyalty of the armies in the distant provinces, not by the divine right of a mad family. Galba, Otho, and Vitellius followed each other to rapid, bloody graves, the Praetorians selling the throne to the highest bidder in a sickening auction of imperial power that exposed the military foundation beneath the civil facade. It took the grizzled, practical military genius of Vespasian, the man who had been crushing revolts in Judea, to finally impose order and establish the Flavian dynasty. He brought stability, a treasury emptied by Nero's extravagance, and an understanding that the spectacle of power mattered as much as the substance. It was Vespasian who started the construction of the Colosseum, the Flavian amphitheater, a monument to blood sport and bread that kept the masses docile and distracted from the brutal reality of their monarch. His sons, Titus and Domitian, solidified this new military monarchy, proving that competence could be inherited, at least temporarily, even if Domitian's tyrannical tendencies eventually led to his assassination by his own household staff and senators. Yet the true Golden Age, the apex of Rome's external power and internal tranquility, arrived with the Nerva Antonine dynasty, the legendary 5 good emperors, a century of calculated genius. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, a century of unprecedented, almost mythic success based on the radical idea of adoptive succession, selecting the most capable man, regardless of blood, to rule the world. Under Trajan, the empire reached its absolute physical maximum, stretching from the deserts of Arabia to the windswept isles of Britain, a world-spanning behemoth of infrastructure, law, and military might, generating wealth beyond measure. But the peak is always the most dangerous place to stand. Even at the height of Trajan's glory, the seeds of retreat were being sown. Hadrian, the great traveler and administrator, understood the terrifying cost of expansion and famously drew the line, abandoning several eastern conquests and building his colossal wall across northern Britain, a defiant stone declaration that the empire had reached its limit and could no longer absorb more territory or peoples. The era of relentless growth was over. The era of desperate defense had begun. This golden century was capped by Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher king, the man who wrote his Meditations while facing down barbarian hordes on the northern frontier, embodying the terrible paradox of the Pax Romana, supreme, reasoned wisdom forced to justify and enact constant, brutal violence against an increasingly pressing external threat. The moment the blood of the last Severan emperor, Severus Alexander, soaked into the Rhine mud in 235 AD, the careful mechanism of the Roman state didn't just suffer instability, it detonated. The Golden Age was not merely over. The entire administrative, military, and economic edifice of the world's greatest power instantly plunged into a 50-year freefall, a sheer drop into the abyss known to history as the Third Century Crisis. The rules of succession, of law, and even of sanity were thrown into the fire, replaced by the brutal, terrifying calculus of the sword, ushering in the age of the barracks emperors. This era birthed a nightmare scenario where the imperial title became less a crown and more a rotating death warrant, brutally stitched together by the coarse ambition of men who knew only the battlefield. The first of this horrifying breed was Maximinus Thrax, a colossal figure rumored to be 8 feet tall, a Thracian strongman who was elevated by his troops and who never even bothered to visit Rome. His rule signaled a profound, chilling shift. The true capital of the empire was now wherever the largest, most restless legion decided to pitch its camp, and the only effective constitution remaining was the blade wielded by the nearest ambitious centurion. Rome was now fighting a civil war while simultaneously being invaded from both flanks by 2 distinct, massive foreign powers, a military impossibility that pushed the logistical and financial capacity of the state past its breaking point. The sheer degradation of Roman might during this period reached its horrifying apex with the tragedy of the Emperor Valerian. Desperate to stop the relentless advance of Shapur I, Valerian led his army into Mesopotamia in 260 AD, only to be defeated and captured alive in a military disaster of unprecedented scale. This was not a quick execution. This was calculated, monstrous humiliation. Shapur I reportedly used the living Roman emperor, the sovereign lord of the entire Mediterranean world, as a literal, breathing footstool upon which to mount his horse, a monstrous, unforgettable symbol of Rome's broken arrogance. And when Valerian finally succumbed to the ignominy and probable abuse, his skin was flayed, carefully treated, stuffed with straw, and proudly displayed as a permanent, grotesque trophy in a Persian temple, ensuring that the most powerful man in the world was reduced to nothing more than furniture and a warning. But the collapse was far from purely military. The financial structure of the empire disintegrated with even greater speed and finality. The constant, insatiable need to pay off the demanding, murderous legions to prevent them from turning on their current emperor led to a catastrophic debasement of the currency. Emperors resorted to clipping and diluting the silver denarius until it contained barely 5% precious metal, effectively printing worthless money to fund endless brutal wars. The result was not just inflation, but soaring hyperinflation that absolutely shattered the concept of commerce itself. Farmers couldn't sell grain for coin because the coin would be literally worthless by the time they reached the market. The sophisticated Roman market economy, which had thrived for centuries, collapsed back into primitive bartering and localized trade. Cities, unable to feed themselves or sustain commerce, began to shrink dramatically. Trade routes were abandoned to bandits and nature, and the majestic infrastructure of roads and aqueducts began its slow, inevitable crumble back into the earth, signifying a deep regression in civilization itself. Under this intolerable strain, the empire, geographically, literally broke apart. By 260 AD, the core Roman territory had fragmented into 3 distinct hostile pieces. In the west, Postumus, a brilliant general, declared himself the emperor of the Imperium Galliarum, the Gallic Empire, controlling the vital provinces of Britain, Gaul, and Hispania. He wasn't acting out of disloyalty so much as sheer necessity. He was succeeding where Rome had catastrophically failed, protecting his regions from Germanic invaders because the central government couldn't spare the troops or the leader long enough to matter. Simultaneously, in the east, the dazzling and defiant figure of Queen Zenobia rose to prominence from the wealthy city of Palmyra. After the capture of Valerian, her husband Odenathus had taken charge, and upon his death, Zenobia seized power with extraordinary ambition, establishing the Palmyrene Empire. This was far more than a simple rebellion. This was an alternative Roman Empire, ruled by a powerful, educated, Hellenized queen, controlling Egypt, Syria, and vast swaths of Anatolia. For nearly 2 agonizing decades, the mighty Roman entity was reduced to a fractured, vulnerable core surrounded by 2 powerful, competing successor states, one run by a Gallic warlord and the other by a Middle Eastern queen. Rome, the invincible, the eternal, was dying a slow, horrific, triple-headed death, drowning in its own blood and worthless coin. The year is 26 AD, and the greatest empire the world had ever known was not just fragmented, it was actively dissolving into a poisonous stew of banditry, plague, and civil war. Three separate, self-declared Roman empires clawed at each other's throats, while the true enemy, utter, unstoppable chaos, consumed the provinces. In the west, the so-called Gallic Empire, run by the usurper Tetricus, controlled the vital provinces of Gaul, Britannia, and Hispania, operating like a barbarian kingdom with a Roman facade, printing its own debased coins and mocking the authority of the distant Italian center. Meanwhile, in the east, the legendary Queen Zenobia of Palmyra, a woman who claimed blood kinship with Cleopatra herself, had seized Egypt, the grain basket of the known world, and was marching through Asia Minor, turning Roman legions against Rome in a spectacular, unprecedented act of defiance. The legitimate emperor in Rome, whoever lasted long enough to wear the purple for more than 6 months, was a phantom, an afterthought, merely the caretaker of an ever-shrinking scrap of Italian farmland surrounded by enemies who spoke Latin just as well as he did, only with more contempt. Aurelian was not a senator, not a patrician, and certainly not a philosopher king. He was a hardened, iron-fisted Illyrian peasant who had fought his way up from the ranks of the cavalry, his reputation forged in the bloodiest battles along the savage Danube frontier. He was pure, distilled military necessity, a man who saw chaos not as a tragedy, but as a problem to be violently solved. When he took power in 270 AD, the situation was beyond desperate, bordering on apocalyptic. The Goths and Vandals were not just raiding, they were streaming across the broken borders, realizing that Rome's defenses were now run by exhausted ghosts. The greatest shock came when the barbarian Githunghi tore through the Alps and actually invaded the sacred soil of Italy itself, smashing the legions that tried to stop them at Placentia and marching with impunity toward the very gates of the city that ruled the world. For the first time in nearly 6 centuries, since the legendary terror of Hannibal Barca, the citizens of Rome could hear the distant war cries of barbarians, feel the actual terrifying vibrations of the enemy approaching their homes, their markets, their sacred temples. The eternal city, which believed its power projected so far that walls were obsolete, suddenly realized it was naked and vulnerable. Aurelian, even as he was dealing with the immediate existential threat of the barbarian invasion on Italian soil, made a decision that sent shivers down the spine of every remaining loyal Roman. He began building walls around the capital. These were not symbolic ramparts. These were the massive, 19-kilometer-long, 6-meter-high brick and concrete Aurelian walls, a silent, monumental admission of failure etched permanently into the landscape. The emperor was literally drawing a massive, desperate circle around the beating heart of the empire, whispering to his people the horrific truth: we can no longer defend the frontier thousands of miles away. We must defend this spot, or everything, our history, our glory, our very name, is lost forever. The psychological impact was devastating, but the military necessity was absolute. After driving the barbarians back in a series of brutal, non-negotiable battles, Aurelian turned his iron gaze eastward. The walls were just a temporary bandage. Aurelian's true mission was to hunt down the 2 mirror empires that mocked Rome's central authority. First, the dazzling, defiant Queen Zenobia, This brilliant queen had successfully built a parallel empire rooted in Persian wealth and Greek philosophy, creating an army that was disciplined and dangerously loyal, ready to contest the Mediterranean itself. Aurelian knew that if Zenobia held Egypt, the richest land on earth and the perpetual source of the Roman grain supply, Rome would starve within a year. The march eastward was a feat of logistical genius and sheer brutal will, a 1,000-mile campaign of forced marches and relentless pressure. Aurelian's legions swept through Asia Minor, reclaiming province after province, culminating in 2 decisive, bloody cavalry battles, first at Emme and then at Emesa. Zenobia's heavy cavalry, the Kleboneri, clad head to toe in shimmering, terrifying armor like living statues of war, were met by the relentless Roman light cavalry, who used hit-and-run tactics to exhaust and shatter the metal giants in the grueling desert heat. The queen retreated to her shining capital of Palmyra, a city famed throughout the ancient world for its wealth, its beauty, and its strategic location, controlling the entire flow of trade from the east. Aurelian laid siege, facing determined resistance, but the desert city could not withstand the relentless pressure of a unified Roman army. When the walls finally broke, Zenobia attempted a dramatic escape on the back of a swift camel, hoping to reach the Persian court and rally aid. But she was captured by Roman light horsemen before she crossed the Euphrates. The queen, the woman who dared to challenge the Senate and declare herself the true empress of the East, was hauled back in chains, displayed as a magnificent trophy, a living testament to Rome's renewed dominance. Aurelian spared her life, knowing her murder would only create a martyr, but he utterly destroyed Palmyra, reducing the pearl of the desert to rubble as a terrifying, unforgettable warning to any who dared to claim the purple outside of Rome's authority. With the East brutally secured, Aurelian turned his gaze westward toward the final piece of the shattered puzzle, the Gallic Empire under Tetricus, the man who pretended to rule Britannia and Gaul. The confrontation was almost an anticlimax, a testament to the utter exhaustion of this long, horrific century. Tetricus, tired of constantly fighting internal revolts and leading a debased, dying state, is rumored to have secretly negotiated his surrender before the Battle of Chalons even began. His heart had left the battlefield long before his body did. Aurelian marched back to Rome, not merely as a victorious general, but as the restorer of the world, restitutor orbis. He had fought and won 12 major campaigns in 5 years, restored the imperial borders, defeated 2 separate self-declared rival empires, and brought the entire fractured world back under one banner. The empire was physically whole again, but the spiritual and economic damage was irreparable. The coinage was worthless. A silver denarius was now barely 5% actual silver, and the corruption was endemic. Aurelian tried to address the monetary crisis, attempting a currency reform that was so harsh and necessary that it sparked massive riots in Rome, requiring military force to suppress them in a shocking display of internal violence. He was a man who understood war better than diplomacy, and certainly better than the subtle, treacherous art of political survival in Rome. In 275 AD, while marching east once more to deal with the inevitable new Persian threat, the man who had saved Rome from annihilation was struck down by his own staff officers, assassinated in a petty conspiracy fueled by fear and misunderstanding over a forged list of executions. The empire was unified, yes, but the root problem remained. The throne was still a death trap, and the crisis was merely paused, waiting for the next tremor.